your sign. This is going to be a series that's going to be looking at all 12 zodiac signs, and I'll be putting out about one video a week on the different signs. We're going to start with Aries. So this video is going to be everything you ever wanted to know about Aries Sun, Aries Moon, having an ascendant that's Aries or a rising sign that's Aries. And we're also going to look a little bit at compatibility stuff. So what energies complement Aries? What kinds of energies are easy to work with as an Aries? And one of the first things I want to say before I even get into it is that you are not your sun sign, meaning that just because you're an Aries sun doesn't mean that that's the most dominant energy in your chart, and it doesn't mean that it's the most important energy in your chart, and it certainly doesn't mean it's the only energy in your chart. So even if you have some big, important things in your chart that point to Aries, it's not everything that you are, and you do need to look at your entire chart to fully understand essentially the astrological blueprint of who you are in your life and who you're capable of becoming and evolving into. But this is a sense of what that Aries part of you looks like, and some tools to help you use it to your benefit to help push you forward instead of push you back. So we're going to start with the basics. The symbol for Aries is usually this sort of V shape, which represents the horns of the ram, which is around the mythology of Aries, which we're going to talk about in a moment. Aries rules the first house of the zodiac, and the first house is about the first impression that we make on people. It's about how people perceive us. It's about new beginnings. It's about new experiences. And I think that one of the important things to understand about the first house is to know that, what you are, you draw. So the energy that you put out into the world most often is the energy that the world sends back to you most often. And so whatever's in your first house becomes a very important sign and a very important energy in your life. And so as a result, we have a special name for it. It's called either the ascendant or the rising sign, and we're going to be talking about Aries rising later on in this video. Aries is ruled by the planet Mars. And I think most people know, but Mars has an association with a sort of warrior type spirit. And that's a big part of the energy of Aries. It's this energy of the warrior. And I think we have to be careful when we think about warriors. It doesn't mean someone who's going into battle in a conventional sense. You can be a warrior of light. You can be a warrior of love. You can be a warrior of peace. You can be a warrior of inner growth. You can be a warrior of the underdog, protecting other people and helping other people. Or you can just be a traditional, conventional warrior. But basically what it means at its core is that this energy seeks to conquer something, to overcome something, to become something through a willingness to accept an element of challenge. We look at the mythology of Aries. There's an association with the myth of the golden fleece, which is about the ram. Mythology is tricky. There's always 1,000 different versions of the same myth, and it's difficult to know which one to narrow in on. So I'm going to give some basic details that are pretty universal across all of the different variations of this myth. There was a woman who was married to a king, and her husband took on a new wife. And that was problematic because the new wife that her husband took on was very jealous of her children. She had one boy and one girl, and started to try and kill them and persecute them and put them in danger. And in order to survive this new wife, this sort of sense of betrayal, the children had to flee. And in order to do that, they were given the support of a ram who had like a super cool coat. Some people say it's got lots of different colors and it's shiny and pretty and fabulous. Some people say it was a golden fleece, but whatevs. Basically, it was like a wicked cool coat and a magical ram. And so the kids ran away, and the ram helps them left, right, and center and uses all its magic to, get them safe. But even despite all of the ram's efforts, the sister dies. So she doesn't make it across this big long river, and the brother does. And so now it's just the brother and the ram. And what does the brother do? He slaughters the ram sacrifices it, skins it, gets its coat, and gives the body back to the gods. Some of the myths say that he uses the coat as leverage to get back into society. Some of the myths say that he gives the coat as a sacrifice to the gods. It doesn't really matter. What we're looking at really is the sort of central pieces that this story is trying to tell us, the main sort of ideas or functions of the myth. And so, what we're looking at is sort of this idea of, these kids who start out as prey. They start as victims of their own experiences, and then they end up as predators when they slaughter the very thing that helped them survive in the first place. It's about this sort of instinct for survival and doing things that are difficult and painful and complicated in order to achieve something that's essentially, seems out of reach or impossible to achieve. It's that fighting spirit. There's a sense of risk-taking. And on some level, we also look at the story, we look at the isolation that they face, going from this sort of community and this family in this place of safety into a place where they're very much alone in the world, and they have to use every resource at their disposal, whether they're the resources inside of them or the resources that have been provided by others, in order to survive. And so all of those elements of the story are really important because they construct what the energy of Aries looks like and how that energy runs in your life. And we're going to spend the rest of this video exploring all of those different areas, those different archetypes, those different lessons that Aries is trying to teach us about who we can become and how we can run this energy in a healthy way to serve ourselves and to serve others. We look at elemental association. So every sign in the zodiac is associated with one of the 4 elements. Aries is associated with the element of fire, and that's really significant. You think about fire as like this incredible, powerful force that can be used to nourish you, that can be used to cook food, to keep you warm, to keep you alive in this sort of cold, difficult environment, or it's an energy that could totally destroy you. And I think there's something about that sort of polarizing duality of fire that's really important. Looking at the fact that we all have choices, we all make choices, and we have to find ways to use the power of this Aries energy to serve ourselves and to support ourselves, and to help other people. So this fire, it's sort of a little on the impulsive side, it's quick moving, it's sort of alchemistic in some ways, it has the ability to constantly shift and change forms, reinvent itself, move into new territories in this really rapid, sort of fearless way. And also, I think more than anything else, it's an energy of doing as opposed to an energy of thinking or an energy of feeling or an energy of being. It's an energy of getting out there and experiencing life in every possible way as a means to grow and change. This element of fire, it's shared by 2 other signs. And those signs are Leo and Sagittarius. And so that becomes kind of important. All 3 signs, Aries, Leo, and Sagittarius, are ruled by fire. And what makes that important is it means that all of those signs, they share a language. They share a sort of approach to living or approach to the world that makes it a little easier when they come together to figure out how to compromise and what path to take and how to relate. And so some of the easiest paths when we look through the zodiac chart is to find signs that have a similar elemental association. It just removes some barriers. It's a little bit of a starting ground. So throughout this video, we're going to talk about all these different elements of Aries and what it is and what it's not and what it can be and all that kind of stuff. And one of the things I want to talk about is what you should be sort of listening for if it falls in different places of your chart. So the sun in the chart is it represents who you are in stillness when no one is around and when nothing's happening to you. And so in a sense, it becomes a sort of purest expression of who you are, right? It becomes your sort of set point, right? And so if you're listening to this as an Aries sun, then I think it's really important to sort of look at all the things I'm talking about as sort of this pure form of yourself. Like, you know, your personal spiritual evolution is about mastering this Aries energy and running it in a really healthy way. That's part of what you're here to do. It's part of what your soul chooses to experience in this life. And it's part of the essence of who you are. Now, if you're an Aries moon, then it's a little bit different. The moon in the zodiac, it represents your emotional body. It's how we feel, what makes us feel, and how we express those feelings. And so you should be listening more to this video, looking at it from like an emotional level, right? Like, oh, I know that, you know, that part of my Aries comes out when I'm having a really hard day, and this part of my Aries comes out when I'm having a really good time. And hey, you know, when this happens, it makes me feel really safe, and when this happens, it makes me feel really unsafe. And so when we look at someone who's an Aries moon, the emotional reactions that are strongest come from experiences that are Aries type experiences. And so you have to be really careful about learning how to identify those things which end up being triggers which can put us in really emotional places, and learn how to twist and pivot our emotional response so that it's working for us instead of working against us. We'll talk about that a lot more in a bit. Then we have someone who's an Aries rising. So Aries rising is like a double punch, you know? It's like it's doubling up on the same energy. The rising sign, as I mentioned earlier, is the sign that's in the first house of the zodiac. So technically it's on the cusp of the first house of the zodiac, but that just means it's at the entryway, okay? It's the doorway into the first house. And so if you have Aries in the first house, and Aries is naturally the ruler of the first house, then you have double that type of energy in your life. And basically it's the external perception or impression of who you are is these Aries type elements. So people perceive you as being like an Aries. People see you for your Aries type qualities. And so this can actually be really difficult, because if you're, like, let's say you're a Cancer sun, so who you are in that still pure form is Cancer, and the entire world perceives you as being Aries, which is very different, then it can be difficult to be able to see what everyone else sees when they see you. And as a result, we can feel a little victimized by other people's experience or impressions of us, or other people's judgments of us. So not always the case. I mean, there's some complementary energies. So, you know, if you're a Sagittarius sun and an Aries rising, it's, you know, an easier fit. But basically what you're going to be looking at is the fact that this Ariesness, these Aries type energies, is how other people perceive you. It's the thing that's most obvious to you to them. And so what you want to do is make sure as much as possible that you're running that Aries energy in a healthy way. So, you know, other people perceive you as a warrior of light. Other people perceive you as passionate and ambitious and driven and engaging and in some ways charismatic, instead of looking at, you know, some of the other elements of Aries that come from a place of woundedness, and sort of pivoting and twisting so that you can be the best of who you're capable of being. So, you know, one of the key elements when it comes to Aries is a sort of idea, and it's encapsulated in that myth perfectly, right? Is like this idea that wherever Aries is in your chart, you have to choose to either be predator or prey. You have to choose to find something to conquer, to accept a challenge, to set a goal, to have an ambition, and to work towards it with all of your might, even when you face opposition, or you end up in a situation where you're the victim of your own experiences. So the universe kind of says, okay, you have Aries energy. You either can go out and conquer the world, or we're going to bring the world and it's going to conquer you. Right? And so it becomes really, really important that as an Aries, that you learn how to accept challenge, that you learn how to set goals, that you learn how to have that sort of drive inside of you to push you forward through difficult terrain, instead of coming to a space in your life where you disappear into this identity of a victim of your experiences. And one of the, the symbols for Aries that I really like is sort of the first spark, that comes when flint hits steel. And the reason that I like that is, if you think about it, it's a sort of incredible force, this alchemical response, where this single spark sort of flies up from flint and steel. And what's important about that is sort of the passionate, powerful energy that it takes when it sort of jumps off of that steel and into the sky, but then also this sort of sense of vulnerability, of aloneness, of being, the only of its kind because it's the first of its kind, and ending up in this environment where, it doesn't have any supports to protect it, so it feels vulnerable and it feels isolated and it feels like the world is closing in on it. And in some ways that is sort of the experience of Aries, is this feeling of like having to fight to survival, having to fight to be who you're capable of becoming. Sorry, I had to plug in there. So, so this first sort of experience, and you feel a little bit isolated and like you're fighting for survival. But, at the core, what you want is to have that fight inside of you. You want to be able to control the force of the energy. And in order to do that, you have to choose your battles instead of allowing them to choose you. And then we look at Aries in terms of ambition and drive. So, Aries, of all the signs, it has, more than any other, it has a sort of thirst to be first, to act, to respond, to react, to do something that hasn't been done before. And there's this association between Aries and ambition and drive and passion and all that kind of stuff. And so all of that powerful energy of Aries can be used in like a really productive way to push forward in the world in a lot of really cool ways. And I think one of the ways that this is really important, like let's say you're an Aries Moon, you have to be really careful because you need to set goals for yourself and push into them in order to feel safe, right? So safety for you means moving forward. The minute that you feel like you've hit a brick wall, or the minute that you feel that you're being held back or stalled in your life, it's going to bring you into a space where you emotionally don't feel stable and happy and healthy. And so part of the job of an Aries Moon is to constantly set new goals in order to constantly move forward. And if you get stalled in one area of your life, then you need to open up another channel so that you can move forward in another area. Otherwise, you're just not going to feel safe. And so that's what it looks like for an Aries Moon. Of course, for an Aries rising, that's someone who, might very well be perceived as being, ambitious and feisty and fiery and all that kind of stuff, right? I wanted to touch just really quickly, like Aries in business is a really interesting idea, or like Aries in career. I'm going to say that like just because you're an Aries sun or an Aries moon or an Aries rising doesn't mean that it has any relationship with what you do for work. What you do for work is reflected in the second house, in the sixth house, and in the 10th house. But at the core, I wanted to say that if you, let's say you're watching this video and you do have Aries in the 2nd, 6th, or 10th house, then you have sort of this Aries in, actually, or 11th house, then you have this sort of Aries in business energy about you. And part of that is this sort of drive to do something that's never been done before, this sort of innovative energy, this ambitious energy, this entrepreneurial drive and fire. And in business, it's really cool. It's someone who really understands when it's running in a healthy way. It's someone who has this willingness to take risks, to do things that haven't been done before, to push into challenging or difficult areas. And of course, as we know, all of those things are, risk is reward, right? So he who dares wins. And there's sort of this ability that Aries has to venture into territories that scare the bejeebers out of everyone else, and as a result, that risk can pay off in big ways. It can also work to your detriment, but if you don't try, then you never succeed, right? So passion and instinct. So, I'm sure, most of you have read blogs about what Aries is, or you've read horoscopes, which I think you should be careful with because they're sun sign based, which means they're rarely accurate. But, so anyway, if you've read any information about Aries at all, then you'll hear that there's an association between Aries and sex, and that's true, and I'll tell you exactly why. Aries has that connection, that sort of instinctual fight or flight response, that sort of instinctual connection to this very sort of visceral, primal element of survival, and sex is about survival of the species, and part of an Aries experience is having that sort of visceral, physical, sexual response. It's a primal energy, it's a creative energy, it's a powerful energy, and it's an important part of what Aries is and how Aries expresses itself. The danger, of course, or the thing that Aries energy has to be really careful with when it comes to sex and passion and all that kind of stuff is making sure that the other person, that it's about both people, and that both people are, the priority is on both people experiencing something that's important and magical and fabulous and pleasurable, and that it's not just about one person enjoying themselves. So, but really, if you want to look at sex and the zodiac, there's a lot of different energies in there. So, and if you're a 12th house, let's say you're a 12th house Aries Moon, for example, then a huge part of sex for you is connection and this sort of desire to have a almost otherworldly experience of sex and sexuality with another person that's magical and spiritual and all this kind of stuff. So it really depends where it falls in your chart, but sex and sexuality and Aries go hand in hand, in part because it's the evolution of the species, it's the survival of the species, and Aries very sort of tuned into that instinctual survival type energy. We also look at sort of Aries and instinct, and it's the same thing. If you look at that sort of like predator / prey energy, and you look at that sort of that willingness to accept challenge and that pioneering spirit and all that kind of stuff, then you know that in nature and in the wild, the only way that you're going to survive is instinct. It's listening to the hairs on the back of your neck when they stand up, and listening to your gut and all that kind of stuff. And when Aries tunes into it, Aries has incredible instinct. They have the ability to really feel truth in their body, to really experience this sort of gut feeling, this sense of knowing. I had a really close friend who had some really strong Aries energy, and when he was in a dangerous situation, the hairs on his neck always used to stand up, and he trusted that. He'd walk out immediately as soon as it happened. And I think for most Aries that's true. It's just a matter of what signal your body is trying to give you about your own safety and your own security and where you are and how well you're doing in that space. Aries, I mentioned this a little bit earlier around business thing. Aries' potential for success is linked inextricably with a willingness to take risk. Aries' life experience is about accepting challenge and difficulty. And when Aries energy is healthy, there's an element of confidence. There's an element of maybe a little impulsiveness, and there's this willingness to do difficult things that scare other people. And so, when Aries is really healthy, you are willing to take risks, and you end up rewarded for taking those risks. That's not to say that you should take every risk. You have to take measured risks, and you have to think things through. And part of Aries energy is learning, when to take risks. And when to be impulsive, and when to slow down, and when to think, and all that kind of thing, and when to listen to that little, the hairs on the back of your neck, or the feeling in your gut, and all that kind of stuff. So it's really about balancing this willingness to do things that are difficult, and this willingness to take risks with this inner knowing, and this, willingness to listen to your gut and to your instinct. So one of the things I talk about a lot in the work that I do, and one of the things I'm going to spend quite a bit of time talking about in this video, is what Aries energy looks like when it's not okay. What Aries energy looks like when it's wounded, and when it's hurt, and when it needs to be healed, right? And so it's not a judgment of anyone who's expressing these types of energy in these types of ways. It just means that, a lot of times people who are exhibiting these sort of like more shadow aspects of Aries, or things about Aries that are unhealed or unhealthy, are doing it because their own that Aries energy that was inside of them, that sort of passion and drive and ambition and all that kind of stuff, was quashed. So they've been judged for who they are, they've been shamed for who they are, they've been put in positions where someone has tried to erase parts of themselves, or they've been put in a position where they're taught that they're not good enough or whatever, and that creates this sense of wounding around this energy inside of them, and it sort of spills out in other ways to compensate for the fact that it's being held back, right? So it's sort of like the waterfall that bursts through the dam, right? And it's this powerful energy, but it only really exists because someone's been really hurt. And so it's about accepting that it exists inside of us, and then using tools to shift it into that powerful energy that we talked about in the beginning, that's like has the potential to do a lot of good. So one of the biggest things that I find in my practice is Aries energy, particularly in women, can really turn into this feeling or this experience where you feel like you're fighting against the world, where you're constantly feeling victimized by your own experiences, where you're drawing people who violate your personal boundaries, who violate you personally, who violate your body. You're drawing abusive experiences. It's this energy that, of feeling victimized by the world, that nothing ever turns out, that you're not good enough, that the world isn't good enough, that no one else is good enough, that that everyone's out to get you, that no one has your back, that you're isolated, all that kind of stuff. So that's what Aries looks like. There's a few different ways that Aries energy kind of spills out when it's not well supported, but one of the biggest ways is slipping into this energy of victim. And like I talked about earlier, you have the choice. You can be predator or prey, right? So if you feel like you're in a position where you're prey, then you have to shift that, set a goal, and be willing to push through challenge in order to accomplish it, in order to get into a space that you no longer feel like a victim of your own experiences, but rather you've taken hold of the wheel in your own life and are making decisions that are propelling you forward. Another one of huge energies that comes up when Aries is running in an unhealed way, when this energy is running in an unhealed way, is that Aries has a really close relationship with shame. With this sort of, I think there's something about, maybe it's sort of the relationship that our society has with sex and sexuality, that our society has with violence, the judgment that our society has on so many things about Aries. I mean, we sort of judge people who are impulsive. We judge people who are impatient. We judge people who are firecrackers. We judge people who are overly ambitious. We judge people who are very sexual, who have a high sex drive, who express themselves sexually. All of those things are things that our society has really shamed us for, which is incredibly unfortunate, because without all of those things, we would never have innovation, we would never have change, we would never have growth, we would never change as a society or as a world, and we desperately need this Aries energy in order to grow and learn. But that doesn't matter. Our society has still found a way to sweep it under the carpet and shame it, and so as a result, someone who's running really unhealed Aries energy is probably experiencing a ton of personal shame. So feeling like like there's something wrong with you, or like there's something broken in you, or like there's something that you can't allow other people to see, and hiding parts of yourself. And again, of course, it's running, healing from that is running through all this positive, healthy Aries energy, and using your passion and your drive and your ambition to, like I said earlier, become a warrior of light, or a warrior of peace, or a warrior of love, or a protector of the downtrodden, or all those beautiful, wonderful things. Aries in time. Aries in time's a little tricky. Even in the best of time, even when Aries is running really like beautifully and well manifested and in like a super healthy, happy, shiny, kind of way, Aries is going to move faster than any other sign. It doesn't want to wait. It wants to get things done now. It doesn't want to talk about it for 3 hours. It doesn't want to debate it for 3 hours. It doesn't want to plan it for 3 hours. It wants to get stuff done. And pure Aries energy wants to, I guess, market testing for pure Aries energy is doing something, and if it fails, it wasn't supposed to be. It's not like talking about it and researching it and all this kind of stuff. And so the danger that I find when I make these kind of comments, or when I talk about these kind of things, is that people go, oh, I'm nothing like that and I'm an Aries. And that could very well be true for lots of you, but that's because you have a ton of Virgo energy, or you have a ton of Capricorn energy, or you have a ton of Taurus energy, or a million other things. So you have to remember, you're not just Aries. And if you're running really, really heavy earth energy on top of your Aries, then no, you might not be like that about time. But pure Aries is like that about time. It has trouble with waiting. It has trouble with patience. It wants everything to happen now. And there can often be this feeling of victimization, this feeling of betrayal over the fact that the world is constantly moving so slow and everything takes so long, and you're constantly in a position where you're forced to wait. And it feels like time is not your friend. And I think at the core, part of Aries life experience is learning to make peace with time. It's not necessarily learning to sit around and wait longer than you have to. It's just learning to understand that not everything is going to happen in your timing, and that you need to figure out what you can control and what you can't control, and ways you can push forward, and ways that pushing forward is actually really just self-sabotage. And I left, this is one of the last things, and there's a reason for it. I think one of the biggest associations around Aries is anger, and it's true. Anger and Aries are related. But I want to say two things. One, most of the people that I speak to who have heavy Aries energy in their chart are not struggling from anger as much as they're struggling from feelings of vulnerability, feelings of shame, feelings of victimization. Two, anger serves a purpose. It's not a bad thing. It's not something that we have to be ashamed of. Anger is how our emotional body sets boundaries. It's how we figure out that something isn't okay. It's how we protect ourselves from danger. It's how we get the strength and energy to fight for things that are important. It's not always bad. And so Aries energy, when it's, there is sort of a sense of anger or indignance, it doesn't have to be a bad thing. But sometimes when Aries is running really heavy in the chart, and you have someone who is wounded or hurt, then anger becomes sort of a wall of fire that gets erected between them and the world. It's this sort of energy that, like, anger spills out into inopportune moments. It spills out into situations that it works to your detriment instead of to your benefit. You don't have control over your own anger. One of the biggest things that I find with really strong Aries people is they don't know why other people perceive them as anger. They think they're speaking normally, and really everyone else perceives them as being overly aggressive. And that's not all Aries, certainly, but some Aries, that's something that they experience. And so it's this sort of part of Aries experiences is learning how to heal your relationship with your own anger and use it as a tool to protect yourself. It's just another, it's like the hairs on the back of the neck going up. It's how you're connecting to your instinct. It's how your soul is trying to communicate to you that something's not right and that something needs to be fixed. And so pure Aries energy needs to make peace with anger. It needs to learn to communicate with anger, but it needs to learn how to control the anger so that they're not controlled by their own anger, and it needs to learn how to express it in a way that's healthy for them and healthy for other people. People with strong Aries, a lot of times a really good expression of anger is through sports. So that doesn't mean that you're angry while you're actually playing, but anger is like this powerful visceral energy, and it can be channeled into running as fast as you can. It can be channeled into swimming or biking or training or getting better at something. And so there can be this shift that sort of like, yes, I honor my anger, I hear my own anger, I'm taking action on the thing that made me angry in the first place, and now I'm going to channel all of that incredible force in a way that that is going to help me, that is going to make me stronger and better, instead of in a way that's going to work against me in the long run. And the last sort of shadowy challenge that Aries has, we talked about this earlier, is Aries in isolation. So, like, Aries has a really direct relationship with isolation. In the myth we talked about earlier, eventually, the sun ends up all alone in the world. He loses his whole family and he's all by himself. And I've met so many Aries, people who just feel alone. They feel like, either they feel the world is against them, or they feel like they can't figure out a connecting point with other people. And they end up in this space where they sort of are longing for connection, but it's just not coming. And I think it's not that Aries' job is to be alone. It's not. There's a lot of really happily married Aries, people with tons of Aries in their chart. There's a lot of really family-oriented people who have a ton of Aries. There's a lot of this kind of stuff. So it's not that you need to be isolated, but I would say that someone with Aries energy needs to find time to be alone, because it's a self-honoring activity. You need to find a way to be by yourself, to listen to your own instinct, to connect with your body, to connect with your passion and your drive and all that kind of stuff. And that's part of the healing process. That's part of the growing process for an Aries. And I have to say also that if you are feeling really isolated, which I think happens a lot for Aries, then a huge part of it is healing those sort of other areas that I was talking about in Aries, things that are unhealed. If you're running the shadow of Aries, which is shame, or that sort of feeling of victimization, or that feeling that nothing is happening on your own terms, or you're running a ton of anger, then all of those energies can block potential relationships from pushing, from coming into your life. They can block connections that you need and that you deserve to have. So I think part of Aries in isolation is making peace with it and realizing that there's not, being alone or not being alone has no bearing on your self-worth. And two, the more you heal yourself, the more you open yourself to be loved by other people, which is what you deserve. And last, we're going to talk about possibilities, which is kind of code for why Aries is fabulous. So I love this picture. I think it's great. It's basically this woman who has this incredibly passionate, powerful heart, and she's just sort of opening up and screaming it out to the world. And I feel like this about Aries. I feel like every Aries has this incredible gift inside of them, this gift of bringing something new and fabulous and fantastic into the world, giving birth to something that's extraordinary and that would serve so many people and be so awesome. And so that sort of passion and that drive and that ambition and that willingness to take risks and all that kind of stuff is a huge part of who Aries is, and a huge part of how that energy runs when it's happy and healthy, and a huge way that you can serve the world. And this picture I like too. This is sort of looking at that part of Aries that I talked about earlier, which is that sort of instinctual knowing, that sort of connection to something bigger than yourself that's running through your physical body, and that willingness to listen to yourself and listen to your gut and listen to your instincts. And those two things come together, and that's what creates real success in your life. That's what allows you to go the distance. That's what allows you to push forward. That's what allows you to heal. That's what allows you to do all those kinds of things. And so I think those are the two most powerful tools that you have for success. And it's all about just pivoting all of these other points, these ways that you've been hurt, and flipping them into this sort of more healed, positive, healthy energy. So thank you very much. Big hugs from Bonnie at Heal with Astrology, and stay tuned. We'll be doing a new video on a different sign every week for the next 3 months.